Worked with the State Department for 22 years, and between 1992, and he's had so many positions that I couldn't list them all on this form. So he's just got an amazing amount of experience all over the world, a specialty in nuclear weapons particularly. But between 1992 and 2018, Dr. Kartchner worked for the State Department. His specialty has always been arms control and nuclear strategy. He lectured all over the world on nuclear issues and was the first U.S. official to visit China, Japan, and South Korea to talk about missile defense systems. And soon after his visit, Japan invested billions of dollars in missile defense. At the State Department, he was a senior advisor for strategic communications, Bureau of International Security and Non-Proliferation, and at the U.S. State Department. Current duties include shaping and implementing a public outreach strategy for U.S. efforts to counter weapons of mass destruction on behalf of the U.S. State Department, Defense Threat Reduction Agency, a senior foreign policy advisor in the Office of Strategic Research and Dialogues, and he works with strategy and plans directorates. And I would be particularly interested to know whatever you're going to say about North Korea and what's going on there. But he began at BYU in the fall of 2017, and can we please welcome Dr. Kerry Kartchner.
Thank you, Matt. I'm really pleased to be here, and thank you for the invitation. I want to say one thing about resumes, and that is, if you have any fluency in social media, put that on your resume, because I have been in a position of filling a position that was going to be working with social media and having a hard time finding people from your generation that put that on their resume. And me and my colleagues were a little surprised at that, because we thought your generation grew up on social media. So if you have any fluency in that is something you could include on your resume. Okay, I'm going to talk about my background a little bit. I'll talk about some career highlights. I'll talk about some of the classes that I'm teaching here at BYU. This is my bio. My family is originally from Utah. I lived overseas as a young boy in Holland and Belgium, and grew up mostly though in Southern California and upstate New York. A little known fact about me is I started BYU as an agronomy major, and I've come a long ways since then. Served a mission to Belgium, Brussels, which means I was coming full loop. I was basically going back to where I grew up. I switched majors as soon as I got back from my mission. I switched to international relations. And then I had a favorite BYU professor here, Richard Beal, and I followed in his footsteps by going to grad school at the University of Southern California. This is an overview of my career. My bachelor's degrees from BYU, master's and PhD from in international relations from USC. I was a defense analyst and contractor for a think tank called Analytic Services. I've been an arms control negotiator for the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency and for the State Department. I was a policymaker and public spokesman for the U.S. Department of State. I managed $6 million in annual studies for the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, and I've taught at the Naval Postgraduate School, Missouri State University, and at the Bush School at Texas A&M University in addition to here. And I'm the author of a number of books that I'm going to talk about. My first book in 1992, Negotiating START. This is a history of the first START negotiations with a foreword by the U.S. ambassador to those negotiations. And like so many others before me, this book is an outgrowth of my doctoral dissertation. So I got my PhD, I finished my dissertation, and I wasn't happy with the dissertation, but it was sufficient to get the PhD. I made this book the dissertation that I wanted to write. Since then, I've co-edited a number of books, including this book on strategic culture and weapons of mass destruction. In 1993, along with some colleagues, I started a series of LDS national security conferences, and we got together to see what the LDS community had to say and contribute to the current dialogue on national security issues. And we held that conference in 1993. This book is the conference proceedings. 10 years later, we held a follow-on conference, and this middle book is the proceedings of that conference, Wielding the Sword While Proclaiming Peace. And then 10 years later, again, we held another conference in Washington, D.C., and that book was just published a year ago, A Time of War, A Time of Peace, Latter-day Saint Ethics of War and Diplomacy. So I've been pleased to be a part of this community building effort, and I hope this also indicates I've spent a large part of my career thinking about the intersection between our religious values and our professional obligations in the national security field. Just last year, I co-edited with some favorite colleagues of mine another book, Crossing Nuclear Thresholds, Leveraging Socio-Cultural Insights into Nuclear Decision-Making. And 4 years ago, I published this book, Unlimited Nuclear War in the 21st Century. And that book won the award from the Chief Scientist of the Air Force for Best Research Product from 2014, which I was very pleased to get that kind of recognition. That book has become extremely popular in national security circles. And about a year ago, the publisher asked us if we would be okay with it being translated into Korean. And so here is that book, Unlimited Nuclear War, published and translated into Korean, and I think that's pretty cool. A think tank in South Korea wanted to make that book available to defense and foreign policy officials in South Korea. And you can only imagine why would they be concerned about limited nuclear war, okay? So that is for that. Here's some career highlights. I want to go through just a few of these. And I want to start by sharing an anecdote that has been very meaningful to me. In my last semester here at BYU as an international relations scholar or a student, I had come to the conclusion that I wanted to pursue national security affairs, okay? And so I took a class from the ROTC in national security. And right towards the end of my last semester, I ran into a Navy recruiter in the Wilkinson Center. The Navy recruiter showed me a career path in naval air intelligence that would get me to the Naval Postgraduate School where I could get a master's degree in national security. And I thought that was great. My wife and I quit our jobs. I was accepted into the Navy. We quit our jobs here in Utah, and we traveled to Pensacola Naval Air Station. And 10 days later, I was discharged for hay fever problems and allergies, which disqualified me from serving in the Navy's air intelligence wing. I was devastated because I thought that was the career, that was the career I felt good about. I prayed about it. I felt good about it. And all of a sudden, I ran into a brick wall, okay? So my wife and I, in despair, didn't know what to do. So we came back here to live with my parents in Pleasant Grove. And 10 days after I returned here, after that catastrophic failure, I got a letter from USC accepting me into grad school. 3 years later, towards the end of my graduate studies at USC, my professor came to me and said, "There is an opening on the faculty at the Naval Postgraduate School. Would you be interested in that?" What do you think I said? At age 27, I became one of the youngest faculty members ever at the Naval Postgraduate School. This is a place 3 years earlier I had aspired to be a student there. And now I was on the faculty there. And that taught me a lot of lessons. One is, if you set out on a career path that is not the right one, Heavenly Father will tell you about that by introducing you to spectacular failures, okay, and brick walls. Because those failures and those dead ends are trying to tell you something, which is, this is the wrong way. But what happens when you experience those setbacks is they mean that a really spectacular opportunity is just around the corner. That's what a setback means, okay? So every juncture in my career has been a leap of faith. And that's one of the key messages I want to leave with you, is that at every juncture in your career, you'll face a leap of faith. And I urge you to take that leap of faith. I served as a consultant during that time to the Navy, to their nuclear planning staff. I then went to work for a contractor. I led a team of contractors in advising the Air Force on arms control implications for their strategic weapons acquisition. Then I got recruited into the government, to an agency called the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, which was part of the State Department. And my first job there was chairing an interagency committee that wrote the first START Treaty compliance report. And that got me deep into the intelligence on Russian nuclear forces. While at the Naval Postgraduate School, I got to teach nuclear targeting at the top secret level. How cool is that? And my students were all mid-career naval officers who were operating the nuclear weapons. And so my job was to teach them the theory and the history. Their job was to teach me the operational side of it. So in the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, I got quickly promoted to finally being a senior member of the U.S. delegation to the START Treaty's compliance negotiations in Geneva, Switzerland. And as a senior member of that delegation, I was assigned by the delegation's ambassador to chair the inspections working group. And now every arms control or diplomatic negotiation will be broken up into working groups. So this was one of the most important working groups on that delegation. That put me as the diplomat responsible for resolving inspection disputes that arose between the US and the Soviet Union, or by this time Russia. In resolving those disputes, I had the opportunity to actually participate in some of the inspections into Russia. So I had the opportunity to go on 5 nuclear weapon inspections in Russia and got to be up and close and personal with Russian nuclear weapons and to see their operations and to see their bases. In connection with that, I also had got the opportunity to become more familiar with U.S. nuclear operations. I toured U.S. Navy Trident nuclear ballistic missile submarines on both the east and west coasts. I got to tour the U.S. Navy's nuclear warhead storage and maintenance facility at Kings Bay, Georgia, and let me just tell you about that. So it's a room about this big, and it's got tools and benches all around it, and in the middle of the floor are 4 nuclear weapons up on stands like they were engines up on an engine stand. And there I am in the room with 450, 250 kiloton nuclear weapons. And there were these young guys in there who were the engineers that maintained those. And naturally, I wanted to touch one, but that wasn't allowed. So. These are some of the weapon systems that I actually got to physically inspect. One of them was the SS-18 ICBM. I went there to count how many warheads it carried, and we wanted to confirm that it had 10 warheads. These are 10 750 kiloton warheads on this missile. That means that missile carried 3 times the explosive power of all the bombs dropped in World War II. 3 times that on that one missile. The Russians had 358 of these missiles. I also got to inspect the SS-25 road mobile ICBM, and I got to inspect the SS-24 rail mobile, which also had 10 warheads on it. And the purpose of these inspections was to resolve ambiguities in the warhead count and to implement radiation detection procedures. I transitioned from that delegation to another delegation, served on the ABM Treaty Standing Consultative Commission when the U.S. withdrew from that agreement. I served as the State Department's public spokesman on U.S. missile defense policy, as Matt mentioned. I was the first U.S. government official sent to China to explain our missile defense policy, and I was also the first U.S. government official sent to these other countries to explain those. And I did that for 3 years. So for 3 years, I did nothing but travel around the world speaking. And that can get a little tedious after a while, but one thing I learned is if you're going to do a live radio interview from your hotel room, please make a note of this. Put out the do not disturb sign first, okay? Because if you have to do that if you don't want somebody yelling room service in the background during your live radio interview, okay? I don't know if you'll ever need that bit of advice, but. In 2009, I served as a State Department representative to the Congressionally Chartered Strategic Posture Review Commission, which was a commission chartered by Congress to look at the future of U.S. nuclear strategy. In connection with that, I got to accompany Senator John Glenn on a tour of the Oak Ridge, Tennessee nuclear weapons complex. I was recruited into a Defense Department think tank on loan from the State Department. The think tank was called the Advanced Systems and Concepts Office, and that's where I became responsible for $6 million in research on an annual basis. And the reason they recruited me, and they called me and said, can you come and please work at our agency for just 1 year, a 1 year detail from the State Department, was that they were sponsoring a U.S.-Russian Track 2 engagement that had run into trouble and needed to be revitalized. And they asked me, as somebody who had worked with the Russians, who knew strategic nuclear issues, to come to that agency on loan from the State Department and revitalize our U.S.-Russian Track 2 engagement, which involved traveling to Moscow and negotiating kind of a re-establishment of this Track 2 engagement. I also then was given the opportunity to help manage these other Track 2 engagements with all these countries that I traveled to, except Pakistan. Our Pakistan Track 2 never met in Pakistan. We always met at an incredibly amazing resort in Thailand, which if you're going to have a negotiation with Pakistanis, I recommend going to Phuket, Thailand for those. Our engagements with the Chinese were often in Honolulu. And it gets a little awkward going to your agency's travel officials and saying, hey, I need to go to Hawaii for a week to meet with the Chinese. And they would say, why do you have to go to Hawaii to meet with the Chinese? And I said, simple, it's the halfway point between Washington, D.C. and Beijing. It's Honolulu. So great location for talks. While I was with that agency, I said, hey, we ought to have these kinds of Track 2 engagements with other countries. And so they gave me the latitude and the funding to start Track 2 engagements with Turkey, Brazil, South Africa, Australia, and Israel. And so I traveled to each of those countries to help set up these informal talks. And as a result of that, all that speech making, Secretary of State Colin Powell gave me an award in 2004, the first annual Secretary of State's Award for Public Outreach. That was a lot of fun. That was a great highlight. I was given that award for giving 120 speeches in 16 countries over a 2-year period. So I look forward to somebody matching that record. These are the courses that I'm currently teaching. I teach the 374 Ethics and International Affairs course. I teach one section of the Foreign Policy class. The department has graciously arranged for me to teach a special topics class on nuclear proliferation, and I have started now, at the department's request, teaching a 470 capstone writing course that revolves around the issue of nuclear weapons in American diplomacy. So that's a little bit about my career, some of the highlights, some of the fun things I've gotten to do. And now I'd like to invite questions if anybody wants to come up to the microphone. I welcome questions about career opportunities, career advice, as well as things related to what I've just gone over.
Hi, I'm Stephen Tibbetts. I just wanted to ask you what your thoughts are on the Iranian nuclear deal and the U.S. pullout from it.
On the Iran nuclear deal? Okay, the Iran nuclear deal is one of the great triumphs of American diplomacy. That deal was so carefully and professionally negotiated. It was a remarkable achievement. And as with any arrangement like that, and it's not a treaty, it wasn't an agreement because nothing was signed, but it was a reciprocal agreement. As with any of those, they only have the value that you put into them. They're only worth what you put into implementing them and the standards to which you hold the countries that are party to those arrangements. And by pulling out of that deal, we've pulled the reins off of Iran, and Iran now is free to resume its nuclear weapons program. We are convinced, when I say we, I mean the people in the non-proliferation community, the nuclear strategy community, we are convinced that Iran right now is not intent on resuming its nuclear program. But Iran retains the capability and the tacit knowledge to manage such a program. So the whole arrangement has not yet collapsed as a result of U.S. withdrawal, but it's a step closer to that. The worst part about the Iran nuclear deal withdrawal is that we turned around and almost immediately rewarded North Korea for developing nuclear weapons. The message we have conveyed to other countries is don't negotiate with us until after you've already achieved a nuclear weapons capability. I'm afraid that's the message we've conveyed. Anyways, does this answer your question? Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Kartchner. Would you be willing to elaborate on how persuasive writing has influenced your career and give advice on how we can develop that
Yeah,
skill?
I'd be happy to say something about that. Okay, so persuasive writing is not necessarily what you would be required to do in the government. In fact, the government disincentivizes originality, especially when it comes to writing. It encourages plagiarism. The reason for that is because you have to get every word in any document that you write approved by the rest of the government, and the rest of the government is most likely to approve it if it is something they've already agreed to, okay? So persuasive writing comes in this format in the government. One of your superiors comes to you, or you go to your superior. In the one case that was meaningful to me, I went to my superiors and I said, here is an issue that is being talked about in the academic and arms control communities. We don't have a policy on it. So I think we need to do an analysis of this issue, and we need to recommend a policy on it. So I was authorized to do that, and I took 5 of my colleagues and we went off and wrote a paper that was enormously persuasive, and it convinced all the people in the State Department to adopt our recommendation. And then it got circulated, without my knowledge, I didn't realize this, got circulated to the rest of the government. And the entire rest of the government found it so persuasive that they also accepted it as policy. And that policy has not changed to this day since then. So even though there's been a lot of pressure to change it. So my recommendation for persuasive reading is you have got to capture your audience's attention with the first sentence in the first paragraph. And in a document, you'll often have a title. The title has to be an engaging title. And then you've got to lay out your case on the first page. The rule of thumb in government writing is assume that your reader, who's the Secretary of State or the National Security Council, they are only going to read the first 1.5 pages. So you only have 1.5 pages to make your case, okay? I recommend that approach even when you have a longer paper, because then you can spend the rest of the longer paper elaborating on the case you made in that first 1.5 pages. Is this helpful?
That's great. Thank
Okay,
you.
sure.
Hi. So I suppose with your having worked with negotiations on a large scale, where things can be very important, I suppose, and it being professional, what advice would you have for us as individuals as we go throughout our lives and maybe have negotiations with family or spouses, or even on a large scale, if we were to work in the government? What would be the best way for us to go about those?
Okay, the single most important piece of advice I ever received, and I found this to be true across personal relationships, is listen before you speak. Okay, and here's what I mean by that. In a diplomatic negotiation with the Russians, for example, say I'm chairing the meeting. I'll come into the meeting and I will say, here's what's on our agenda for today. Do you agree with this agenda? You always agree on the agenda first. And then I would say, can you summarize for me the Russian position on this issue? Then I invite them to give me the Russian position. Then I ask questions, and I ask questions that show that I understood and listened to what their position was. And I'm not criticizing their position, I'm not advocating it, I'm not attacking it. What I'm doing is I'm conveying to them that I heard them and I understood them. Then they will be in a much better position to reciprocate by listening to you. And I found this rule, by the way, works well in interpersonal relationships too. And you can check on that by asking my wife. I'd like to introduce Britt Kartchner, my wife, in the very back. And she can talk to you about our communication styles, right? Thank you. Is that responsive to your question? Listen before you speak, and make sure the other side has understood that you've listened.
My name is Jared Smith. I was glad to hear that you said that you switched to international relations, because I'm kind of considering that. And recently I've heard, actually went on the Capitol trip last week, and the panel there put a heavy emphasis on, while you're in college, focus on learning hard skills like statistics, economics, that type of thing. And so I'm just curious, what benefits have you seen maybe from learning those types of skills while you were in college, and like how they helped you in your career?
So I avoided every statistics class and economics class I could, and I actually regret that. I could have used more economics and more statistics. Mm-hmm. But what I did learn in my classes here, I learned the theory and the history of national security affairs and foreign policy. I had a fascinating class here on the theories of international relations. Mm-hmm. And a few years later, I was asked to teach the class on international relations theory. Mm-hmm. And having taken those classes here stood me in really good stead when I had to teach those classes later on. Mm-hmm. So I recommend the economics and the statistics, but I also recommend learning the theory and the history too. So
Okay, thank you.
you're welcome.
Hello, my name is Elizabeth Watcott, but you know that. I was just wondering, you've worked on very sensitive topics, right? Nuclear proliferation, like weapons and arms control, very difficult topics. Have you ever been in a circumstance where you were in disagreement with the administration that you were called to represent about what the right thing was to do, and how did you reconcile that? Because I'm a person that might be interested in government service, but I'm also hesitant to work for an administration that I don't agree with fundamentally. So just how do you manage that?
Okay, I have a few things to say about that. There's actually only one time in my career where I really had a moral dilemma about carrying out my duties. I had been sent to Germany to talk about U.S. policy regarding weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And does everybody know about the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? There weren't any. I think that's the main point, okay? But that was not the official position of the government at this time. But a few weeks prior to that speaking trip to Germany, I had attended a briefing at the National Security Council where they had gone over, where the intelligence community presented their best evidence for weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And it was very circumstantial. There wasn't really a compelling smoking gun. But our official talking points were to say that the evidence indicated that with great deal of confidence that we would find a weapons of mass destruction program in Iraq. So that means we would find some evidence that there was. And I was speaking at in this conference, or at this workshop, and one of the member of the audience said, "What is your view of what really is going on in Iraq with regard to whether or not there are weapons of mass destruction there?" Okay? So in that moment, I had a choice to parrot the official position or to say the truth as I understood that truth to be. And I said, I believe that the evidence is largely circumstantial. And you remember the Secretary of State had gone to the United Nations and talked about how compelling the evidence was. So I was contradicting the Secretary of State. And I expected to hear about it when I got back, because I was certain that was going to be in the newspaper the next day. And it may have been in the newspaper, but I never got in trouble for it. And I think it's because the rest of my colleagues in the government also recognized the truthfulness of what I had said. But given that, I have never, besides that moment in my career, ever had a moral dilemma or was put in an ethically compromising position. Okay, maybe when the Russians offered me a drink of vodka, okay, which I thought was water. Okay, so believe me, I sinned in ignorance. Okay. But I almost spit it up all over the uniform of the Russian general in front of me, which would have been a wonderful diplomatic crisis. So, anyways, is this, Elizabeth, is this responsive to your question?
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Miranda Maynard. And I was wondering, so when you're in college, grad school, et cetera, when you're young and you're just sort of starting out, but you want to go into the government, what sort of skills and attributes would you develop to make yourself a true asset?
Okay, that's kind of an open-ended question because the government, the executive branch employs 3 million people, and they cover a wide range of skills. But interpersonal relationships, ability to get along in a team, to contribute to a team, plus a deep background in the history and theory of a certain area. And when I talked about economics and statistics, I think those are prerequisites. But it's showing that you excel in your chosen area of expertise for all the civil service kinds of positions, because they're looking for professionals. Now, if you want to go into the Foreign Service, which is a wonderful career opportunity, those skills are also really important, but it is also important for that to know American government and American history, because the Foreign Service is looking for people to be representatives of the United States. So you've got to know the United States to be a representative. That's a little secret that not many people know about the Foreign Service and the Foreign Service exam, is being fluent in U.S. history and U.S. government. Anyways, is that somewhat helpful? It's
Absolutely.
really any career that you feel passionate about, there will be some government opportunity for that in that area.
Thank you very much.
Okay, you're welcome.
Hi, my name's Cami. Regarding the Foreign Service exam, could you give your best tips and tricks on how to prepare?
Okay, I've never taken the Foreign Service exam because I was a civil servant and not a Foreign Service officer. But I was trained in recruiting Foreign Service officers, so I can speak to that a little bit. And the most important one is what I just said. You need to be familiar with American government and American history and American culture. And I know that seems counterintuitive, because you're looking to be in the Foreign Service. So everybody thinks you need to be an expert on foreign policy and international relations, which is all really good. But you also need to know American government, culture, and history. Beyond that, here's a couple of things that I would. So when you go in and take the Foreign Service exam, the first part will be a written exam, and it will test your knowledge of all these things. But at some point, you'll advance into a team building exercise. And there is where they are looking for your ability to work together with a team, to contribute to that team's success, and to be a leader within that team. So they're going to be looking for your interpersonal skills, your team building skills. And so those are things. And you know where we get that, in the LDS faith, where we get that is chairing all the meetings, the Boy Scout meetings, the priesthood meetings, the Relief Society meetings. We get opportunities to chair those meetings, and it is surprising how much confidence that experience will give you when you go into a professional setting. Anyways, are these some ideas that I hope? So occasionally, fairly frequently, we have Foreign Service officers cycle through here on campus. And I really encourage those of you interested in the Foreign Service to attend those presentations and to ask them these kinds of questions. But I hope that's somewhat helpful.
Can you just take a moment and sort of explain the two career tracks in the State Department?
Yes.
I'm not sure that you've kind of alluded to it a little bit, but let's be more specific.
Okay, so the State Department is split 50-50 between Foreign Service officers and Civil Service officers. The Civil Service officers are career-long professionals that have devoted their careers to developing expertise in some specific area. The Foreign Service officers have developed expertise in handling relationships and diplomacy with other countries, and they move around. They move every 3 years, like the military. Every 3 years, you will be moved to a different country, and you will have to learn a different language. They will try to keep you in a region, but you will normally have to learn a different language every 3 years. On the third assignment, they'll usually rotate you back for 3 years in Washington, where a Civil Service officer will have to train you in what to do. They're just throwing that in. So Foreign Service officers, your family has to be supportive of that career choice. But if you're up to learning a new language, if you're ready to live in different countries and move every 3 years, it is a fantastic, exciting career choice. Now, what I liked about my career is I got to be the expert with 20 years experience and a PhD in the subject. Okay, that gave me a lot of authority to speak on these issues. But I also got to do the diplomatic and traveling things that foreign service officers got to do. So I really feel like I got the best of both worlds. But the Foreign Service is really an important recruiting thing, and the Civil Service, though, is also a career option. Is that?
Can you say a little bit more about the kind of training and background that would be ideal or sort of typical maybe for each of those?
So typically for the Foreign Service, it's somebody who's majored in political science or international relations, but also other things, because often you can't get in on the first try in the test, and you have to come back. And sometimes I've heard of people that came back 10 years later. So what that means is you've got to have a backup career already in mind that you go into while you wait for that Foreign Service opportunity to arise. That career will give you really substance and give you maturity for dealing with it in the Foreign Service career. In the Civil Service, it's hard to say because we need people from all different career paths. In the International Security and Nonproliferation Bureau that I worked in for the last 10 years at State, we had a lot of people with hard science backgrounds, biology, physics, chemistry, nuclear engineering. Those hard sciences are really valuable in a policy career context, too. The one thing I would mention about a career is that a master's degree is almost a prerequisite. In all the hiring decisions I was involved in, the first cut we made was between those with
Civil, foreign, or
civil
both?
service,
Civil
not
service.
foreign service. Foreign service, you need another career background. But in civil service, a master's degree is almost a prerequisite.
Do one more, and then I think we're
Okay.
out of time. So if you got one more.
Yeah.
Sure. Hi, my name's Drew Horn. I appreciate your answer to that question. It was really helpful. I was wondering if you could also speak a little bit to the difference between opportunities in the intelligence community and the foreign service. That's something I've been thinking about.
Okay, yeah, let me say a few things about that. So the intelligence community is also divided into two parts. One is the operational side and one is the analytical side. Latter-day Saints, as a rule, are overrepresented in the analytical side, but way underrepresented in the operational side. And can you guess why that is?
Moral dilemmas.
That's because the job description on the operational side is lying, cheating, and stealing. That's the job description. Okay? Don't kid yourselves that you're going to go into the operational side of the intelligence community and get away with lying, cheating, and stealing. That's pretty much the job description. And there are Latter-day Saints who go into that career and are successful in that career. And it's interesting what they've said to me about the way they deal with it. They take a strictly utilitarian or consequentialist moral stance, which is, I'm lying, cheating, and stealing for a greater good, which is true. Okay? On the analytical side, they are looking for people in regional expertise with language backgrounds. That's the most important thing. I hope that helps.
No, it did, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay.
Let's end it with lying, cheating, and stealing.
Yeah, there's something to be said for that.
I'm sure you can stay and interact if you have other questions, but we'll stop there for now. Thanks, everyone.